Hi, I'm Felix. I'm a climate justice ambassador since 2007, and so far I'm one of over 50,000 ambassadors. And I'm really glad that you want to join us and become an ambassador as well. We started Plant-for-the-Planet as a very small project in Germany, but now there are children and youth all around the world that have joined us to spread our message. And when we started Plant-for-the-Planet back then, 10 years ago, we thought we had to save the polar bear. But soon after we understood that this is not really about saving the polar bear. This is about saving our future. This is in Bangladesh. In some areas, the floods are getting worse, while at the same time, the droughts are also getting worse in other parts of the world. This is in China, in North Africa. And this kid is not looking at its reflection in the water, but it's drinking. And this is why we made the sticker, Save the Human. And back then, we started Plant-for-the-Planet after finding out about Wangari Maathai. She's a Peace Nobel Prize laureate from Kenya, and in 30 years, she planted 30 million trees with many other women there. And that inspired us to do the same and start planting trees as well. So we planted our first tree in 2007 in Germany, and from there it grew into a local competition and then into a global movement. And so far we've managed to plant over 14 billion trees. Of course, that wasn't just the work of us children and youth, but this was with the help of governments, of companies, of organizations, all uniting to work together for one common goal, which is to plant 1 trillion trees, 1,000 billion trees, which is about 150 trees for each person in the world. And we children and youth of Plant-for-the-Planet also set ourselves a second goal, which is to become 1 million climate justice ambassadors. So children and youth like you and me that are active all around the world to spread our message and also to plant trees. And so far, we've already empowered 51,000 such ambassadors. And all these ambassadors are empowered at our Plant-for-the-Planet Academies. These are one-day workshops that are taking place all around the world, at which we have normally about 100 participants from loads of different schools who learn what the climate crisis is and what the poverty crisis is. These academies always start with a presentation from another student who's already joined or participated at a previous academy. After the presentation, all the participants practice giving presentations. So we notice that it's very easy to give presentations ourselves and do the same. After that, we plant trees at these academies, and then we do something called the World Cafe, where we collect ideas to different questions like, how do we get other children and youth to join us? Or how do we get the media to report about our projects? Or how do we organize a tree planting project? And then we make plans what we want to do ourselves in our schools. For instance, we set ourselves a goal how many trees we want to plant. Or we make a plan where we want to give presentations to get other children and youth involved. And at the end of the academy, we present these plans in front of all the other children and youth. And at the end of the day, everyone who wants to participate receives a certificate as a climate justice ambassador. Now, let's look at the world. This is the world as we learn about it in school. The bigger a country is by land area, the bigger the country is on this map. But the world also has many different faces. For instance, this is the world by cars. So the more cars the country has, the bigger the country is on this map. So for instance, the United States and Europe are rather big, while Africa and South America are rather small. Now, this is the world by people that are living with less than $1 a day. It's nearly impossible to see Europe or the United States, but Africa and India and China are huge. Now, this is the world by license fees, which is essentially what all the money goes to. And we have the US, we have Europe, and more of the US. This is the world by population. The US Americans and we Europeans together are only about 10% of the world's population. But we produce nearly 60% of the global CO2 emissions. So we are a small part of the population, but we are a big part of the problem causing the climate crisis. Now, many of you will have learned and heard about the greenhouse effect before. If we wouldn't have an atmosphere around our planet, it would be much too cold for us to live here, because all the sun rays that come from the sun will be reflected back away again. So luckily we do have an atmosphere, and because of that, some of those heat rays are trapped inside, which is great. But because of all our greenhouse gas emissions, mainly these CO2 emissions, not as many of these heat rays can get back out again. And because of that, it's getting hotter. So where do all these CO2 emissions come from? There are two main sources of CO2 emissions. They're the natural sources, like forest fires or volcanoes. And these are not new. These have always existed. But the important thing is they were always in balance with the world. The world was always able to absorb as much CO2 as it produced. So there was always this balance. But now, we humans are also creating CO2. For instance, by destroying forests, by eating a lot of animal products, a lot of meat, or by flying around the world. And because of this, we're now producing more CO2 than the Earth can absorb. And there no longer is this balance we used to have. So where does all of this CO2 come from? A lot comes from US Americans. One person in the United States produces about 16 tons of CO2 every year. A European and a Chinese produces about 8 tons of CO2 a year. And an African produces only about 1 ton of CO2 a year. Now let's look at the northern part of our planet. Let's look at our planet from the top. So we have the Arctic ice, and just below it we have the Greenland ice. Does anyone have an idea what the two main differences between these ice areas could be? Exactly, very good. The first main difference is the thickness of the ice. The Arctic ice is on average 2 to 3 meters thick. Does anyone have an idea what how thick the other ice is? How thick the Greenland ice is? More than 5 meters? More than 10 meters? More than 100 meters? More than 1,000 meters? Exactly. It's about 2,000 to 3,000 meters thick. 2 to 3 kilometers. So the Arctic ice is only 2 to 3 meters thick on average, and the Greenland ice is 2 to 3 kilometers thick. And the other main difference is that while the Arctic ice is swimming in water, there is land under the Greenland ice. So, because the Arctic ice is not very thick, and it's already in water, if it melts, the sea level won't rise. But if the Greenland ice melts, which is so incredibly thick and on land, then the average sea level will rise by 7 meters all around the world. But the Arctic ice is still very important to us, because most of the sun rays that shine onto the ice are reflected back away again. So it's like a mirror and a refrigerator. It keeps the Earth cool. But if this ice melts, then the water beneath it will absorb most of the heat, making the climate crisis even worse. And the worst part is the Arctic ice is already melting rapidly. This is what the Arctic ice looked like in 1980, and this is what it looked like in 2012. And these were taken during the same season. Now, if the Greenland ice does melt completely, and the sea level rises by 7 meters, many of our most important cities all around the world will be underwater. The worst part is that about 40% of the world's population lives near the coast. So many people will have to leave their homes because of flooding. And our glaciers are already melting all around the world. This glacier in the Alps melted nearly completely in just 60 years. But it's even worse in the case of the Himalayan glaciers, because about 2 billion people in Asia rely on the rivers that come from the Himalayan glaciers to bring them fresh drinking water. But if this ice melts and there no longer are any glaciers in the Himalayas, then there will be a huge drinking water shortage in these countries in Asia. And because of the flooding we talked about earlier, because of the lack of drinking water we just discussed, and because of droughts, many millions of people will have to leave their homes all around the world and become climate refugees. There's some estimates that talk about 200 million or even 500 million climate refugees until 2050. So how do we know that what we are talking about now, what we're experiencing now is special? How do we know that it hasn't happened before in the last hundred thousands of years? Scientists are able to tell us that because of a very clever technique called ice core drilling. So what they do is they go to glaciers, or for instance the Greenland ice we just talked about, and then they drill into the ice. Up to 3 kilometers deep, and they take out these ice cores, which are like long tubes of ice. And you can imagine when 600,000 years ago the snow fell onto the ice, it trapped little air bubbles inside, and then the snow froze and these air bubbles are still there, and the new snow came and froze again, and it created these layers. So scientists are able to count back these layers and then analyze these air bubbles. And when they analyze these air bubbles from maybe 600,000 years ago, they can find out how high the temperature was back then, and they can also find out how much CO2 was in the air back then. And this is what they found out. It looks complicated, but it isn't even that complicated. The first important thing they found out is that whenever the CO2 concentration went up, so whenever there's much CO2 in the air, the temperature also goes up. And when the CO2 goes down, the temperature also goes down. So there's a very clear link between CO2 and temperature. And the second important thing they found out is that over the last 600,000 years, so that's way longer than humans are on the planet, over the last 600,000 years, the amount of CO2 in the air was never more than 280 parts per million. So if you imagine 1 million little particles of air, never more than 280 of them were CO2. But today, we have more than 400 parts per million in the atmosphere. So from these 1 million air molecules, more than 400 of them are CO2. And this is still rapidly increasing. So we might even reach 600 parts per million in the next few decades if we do not change the way we act. And because of this rapid increase in CO2, the temperature will also increase dramatically. Now, why is tree planting so important? What can trees do? what they do is they take up this carbon dioxide, this CO2 that we produce, and then they store the carbon in their wood, in the wood of the tree, and then they release oxygen. So trees, by uptaking this carbon dioxide and storing this carbon, are essentially the only machines that we have today that can store the CO2 and fight against the climate crisis. And obviously trees also have many other benefits like shade and fruits and so on. Trees alone are not the solution though. We also have to do a lot of other things. And because of that, we children and youth of Plant for the Planet asked ourselves in the last couple of years how we would save our planet if we were the heads of governments of the world. So if we had all the power, how would we save our future? And in these discussions, we came up with a 3-point plan. The first point of our 3-point plan is that from 2050 onwards, we can no longer pollute anymore. So we can no longer burn fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas. We just have to stop polluting. We have to stop creating CO2 from 2050 onwards. That's the first point. The second point is that even until 2050, so between today and 2050, there's also only a limited amount of CO2 we can still produce. And that's about 1.5 tons per person per year. So remember from earlier when we said that the average American produces 16 tons of CO2? They now have to go down to 1.5 tons of CO2. The European that produces 8 tons has to go down to 1.5 tons. Now, that's hard to achieve in a very short time. So the people that are currently polluting more can buy some of these emission rights from the people that pollute less. So they may pollute a little more, and in return, today's poor people will receive money to invest in education, to invest in healthcare, and so on. And the third point of our 3-point plan is obviously to plant trees. And as we mentioned earlier, it is to plant 1 trillion trees, so 150 trees per person. Today we already have 3 trillion trees, so about 400 trees per person. And we have space to plant another 1 trillion trees. And if we manage to plant these trees, they would absorb about 1/4 of human-made CO2 emissions every year. So they won't solve the climate crisis, but they're a very important step. They are like a time joker by giving us a little more time to reduce our CO2 emissions globally. Now, just knowing about this doesn't help. We have to convince other people to do exactly that. So this is why we send letters to all the heads of governments, all the presidents of the world, asking them how they are planning to save our future. And we also told them about our 3-point plan. And we also went to many parliaments, like the European Parliament, and told them about our 3-point plan. And we also went to many local governments, like the mayors of our cities, and talked to them. And they are our most important allies. In many of the cities all around the world where Plant for the Planet ambassadors are active, by giving presentations and planting trees, we often have the support of our local mayors. So when you start your activities in your city and in your area, try and ask the mayor for a meeting and convince him to be your patron and support you with all your activities. That will make your work a lot easier. And in addition to convincing governments and companies to do something, we also have to convince the people that something has to be done. And one way we do that is through our campaign Stop Talking, Start Planting, where we cover famous people's mouths to show that we have to stop discussing these problems and actually get down to action. We have to do something, like planting trees. And it's a wonderful way to convince the people and to spread our message. For instance, we took one such picture with the King of Spain, and one day after we took it, it was in all newspapers. And not just in the newspapers, but on the cover pages of the newspapers. Here it's on the side, but we count that as well. Some of our ambassadors also made an e-card, which means that when you go on our website and click e-card, you'll get that window. Then you can upload a picture, like the President of Mexico. If the picture doesn't fit, just upload another one. And if it still doesn't fit, you can use the arrow keys and then send it to your friends. And many of our ambassadors have also protested, have demonstrated in their cities to tell the governments that we demand more action, that more needs to be done to fight the climate crisis and to save our future. For instance, we had a big protest in Germany during the COP15, the big climate conference in 2009. And we've had similar protests all around the world. And one picture from our protests even came into a German school book. And we children youth, the Plant for the Planet, also wrote a book ourselves. It's called Tree by Tree and has been translated into 16 different languages. And most importantly, Plant for the Planet also has a democratic structure, which means that all our 1,000 ambassadors, including you, will be able to elect or are able to elect our global board. So our representatives of children and youth every year, and this global board decides how we'll fight for our future, what projects we'll do next, and how to continue our work. And they represent us all around the world. And when people go onto our website, when you go on our website and plant a tree in our virtual forest, and then donate, we at Plant for the Planet will plant this tree in real life. To do that, we've hired 80 foresters in Campeche, a part of Mexico, and all they do all day is plant trees. And on average, we plant a tree every 15 seconds, which is about 5,500 trees a day. So with 20 euros, we are able to plant 20 trees. And 1 year after we've planted the tree is already taller than I am. And we're currently also working on another project called Make the World Look Better. As you might know, to produce a t-shirt out of cotton, you need about 2,000 liters of water. So when we started making our own Plant for the Planet t-shirts, we looked around and tried to find out if there's a better way to make t-shirts. And we found out that you can make t-shirts out of wood, out of trees. So we started making the tree shirts. Now some of you might be thinking, isn't that counterproductive? On the one hand, they plant trees, and then they also use the trees to make their t-shirts. But what's really important to understand is that when you use wood, for instance, to make furniture or to build a building, then the carbon that was stored in the tree will continue to be stored in the wood, in the building. So by turning an old tree into a building, we're able to extend the storage of this carbon. As long, obviously, as you replant that tree and plant a new tree in its stead. So it's really important to understand that it's a good thing to use wood, as long as you don't just burn it or let it rot, as long as you use it. So because of that, we are making our t-shirts out of wood, but we don't just want to wear those ourselves, we want to spread the idea and get loads of people to wear those. So we're gonna come up with good slogans like looking wood and to promote these t-shirts all around the world. And we're also working on another project called the Change Chocolate. A couple of years ago, we wanted to start a project with the chocolate industry. But the chocolate industry didn't want to support us. So we said, let's make our own chocolate. And this turned into the Change chocolate, which is now the most sold fair trade chocolate in Germany. And the best part of it is that all the profit goes to tree planting. So for every 5 bars of the chocolate we sell, we are able to plant a tree. And of course the chocolate is also carbon neutral and fair trade. And we're currently working on an app for the Change chocolate, which means that if you're out and about in the city, near a store that sells the Change chocolate, you'll hear a beep in your pocket and know where to go shopping. And a few years ago, we asked the astronauts on the International Space Station if they wanted to try our chocolate as well. And they did. So a few weeks later, we put 12 bars of the Change chocolate onto the Albert Einstein, a space shuttle that took the chocolate to the International Space Station. 2 bars of chocolates for each one of the astronauts. So our chocolate is also astronaut food. Now, you might be asking yourself, that's all great, but what can I do? How can I get involved? And there are 3 really important things you have to do. The 3 most important things you have to do is 1, give presentations, 2, give presentations, and 3, give presentations. Because we have to spread the word. We have to convince all other children and youth that the climate crisis is important and that we have to plant trees to fight it. We have to convince adults and especially politicians and business leaders that they have to do something. And it's a very, very strong message. If children and youth explain to adults that something has to be done. So the most important thing you can do is give presentations to spread our message. You can obviously give these presentations together with your friends. That may make it easier. And you can look at this talk a couple of times online to practice giving the presentations. And you can start giving the presentations in your class first, and then give it in front of other classes, maybe at your school, and then maybe give it in front of students at a different school, and then also move on to giving the presentations in front of adults. And what you can also do is start a club, start a Plant-for-the-Planet club in your city with your classmates and your friends to be able to work together to organize projects in your city. For instance, I'm part of the Plant-for-the-Planet Club of London. And obviously, don't forget to give as many presentations as possible. Good luck, and don't forget our slogan, stop talking, start planting.